This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Hi, I'm Ng-A-Qui and welcome to this edition of African Drums. As you know, this is a television arm of Cuffy 250 Committee, which is dedicated to the raising of consciousness in the African community and also education, through education and self-empowerment. As you know also, this is the election season. The elections are about less than 6 weeks away, and usually we have all kinds of issues coming up. One of the big ones has to do usually with race. The questions of race and the significance of race in election season. These are the issues that we want to talk about this evening. There are two programs that are dedicated to elections, and this is the first of two. This program specifically, we want to look at sort of the historical sequence of beginning in 1638 and going from 1638 to now, breaking our history into those periods, into different segments of that period, and then going from there and trying to understand what impact race had during the different periods. To help us understand the issues and the scope of the nature of the problems, we have with us tonight Mr. Vincent and Mr. Aubrey Norton. Both have tremendous experience in this area, and both are no newcomers to this program. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, sir.
Now, if we break up, and I'm going to start right into the program. If we start with the period 1638 to now, and we break it up into 5 periods: 1638 to 1838, 1838 to 1966, which is the pre-independence period, 1966 to 1992. Which is the period what I consider of African presiders, where we had Mr. Burnham and Mr. Hoyt as presidents, and then the period 1992 to now, where we have basically Indian presiders, and I'm talking about the Jagans, Mr. Jagdeo and Mr. Ramatar. So if we look at those 5 periods, could you start us off, Mr. Hines, Mr. Alexander? Start where you were comfortable, so that we can, and then we'll work either forward and backward.
Well, first of all, if we look at the very first period, we could see the beginnings of the formation of what it could be, what is referred to as the plural society. We know that there is no debate about the fact that the Amerindians were already here. Mm-hmm. We know of the coming of the Europeans, right, and we know of the bringing of the African slaves.
So we have 3 races.
There is also information to suggest that the Africans may have been here predating this period.
Right.
So we see essentially the beginning of a plural society, a beginning which is marked with antagonism. Mm-hmm. Because the coming of the Europeans was a coming in the form of conquest, mm-hmm, and not conquest that only related to the physical place, but an attempt to enslave in the first instance, mm-hmm, the Amerindians. Mm-hmm. Of course, that venture was not very successful, mm-hmm, and so we saw them having the second wave where they brought African slaves. What's interesting about that, obviously bringing African slaves would have created an antagonistic relationship between the Europeans who brought them and the African slaves themselves. But in addition to that, as a mechanism for territorial control, making sure that they were able to keep the African slaves within the territory of conquest and within the system of slavery, they then sought to have an arrangement with the Amerindians, who they had failed to enslave, to be police of the interior of the hinterland, in the sense that they were supposed to be returning to the estates any African slave who sought to escape and go into a situation of freedom. So that what we saw arising was the creation of another antagonistic relationship between the African slaves and the Amerindians, because they were not encouraged to have any sort of friendly relationship, since one was going to be policing the other and returning to the Europeans. Now, that in a sense created a kind of a hierarchy, in the sense that the Europeans were the ones who were creating these situations in their interests, but at the same time putting the other ethnic groups at war. And so that is where I think a lot of the antagonism which we still experience today may have had its origin. It's important to know that in countries where you didn't have that kind of situation, for example in Jamaica and so, the Maroons were able to establish their settlements outside of the area of slave European control. This did not quite happen in Guyana, essentially because of the system they put in place to interfere with the possibility of the escapees establishing their own communities, like in Jamaica and like happened in Suriname. So one looks at the history of Guyana, one sees from the very inception a society built on antagonism between and among the groups that were settling, and therefore there could be no cohesive oneness about the development of the country. And I think one should note in all of that in the case of Guyana, unlike probably the case of Barbados, there were a lot of absentee estate owners, so they had no real interest in the total development of the country. What they had an interest in is the exploitation of the resources and the people to benefit them, benefits which they largely used in Europe to enhance their own well-being.
Okay. Or we pick it up from there now.
Well, I would underscore the fact that well, first of all, I agree with Vincent in terms of the categorization of the various groups as it relates to ethnicity. But I also want to add that a very important aspect of the society at the time was it was characterized by resistance. Because to the extent that the slave master attempted to dominate the slave, it had the inverse proportion of the slaves rebelling in various forms. So that you will see in the particular period we're talking about, there have been slave revolts, slave resistance, and the most known is 1763. So I would say that what in essence that did is that it etched into the psyche of the African this whole need to resist. Of course, not all would have resisted. And so you also had divisions amongst the Africans, particularly amongst the field slaves and the house slaves. And the tendency therefore was to have those divisions, and those divisions acted in some regard negatively amidst the African community, but positive for the European community in the sense that they were able to have other divisions that permitted the Africans to not at a very early stage get rid of the system. So to me, you have a system in which there was ethnic division, class division, and color. Because with the Europeans, I think it took on more color than class, though it was class. I mean, it is vivid to the eyes that we are different in a way that it isn't with other groups. And so, to me, this particular period provide a good understanding of where the African society was heading. First, there was no exposure to administration, which meant that when the next period comes, there will be problems because you didn't have the experience of administering the society. You are essentially a slave, the property of a slave owner. And that process deprived Africans of much learning in terms of administration, etc. Then if one looks at the Amerindian that Vincent mentioned, that they became slave policemen, among other things, but they also developed the skills of garnering their food, etc., and had a certain amount of independence, which the African community didn't have. It is one of the, how do I call it, historical problems, in the sense that though the Amerindians were relatively free within their land, they didn't develop the administrative skills as well like the Europeans came with. And so to me, another characterizing feature of the period is not only the subjugation of the African and the Amerindian, but placing them at the lower rung of the social structure because of the absence of access to power in terms of administration, etc.
Okay, so coming from out of that period, though, we see in 1838, shortly after the abolition of slavery, we had Africans buying villages, buying plantations and so forth, and developing that sense of independence, right? Because they actually purchased the like Victoria and a number of villages, about 182 villages, and administered them. So between 1838 and 1966, that's a broad period. That includes a whole number of things which I broadly term the pre-independence movement, which included labor unions and the established, and this is when the East Indians came into, which now adds another race. And this is the importance of the historicity. Originally you just had the three, the Amerindians, the Africans and the Europeans, and now you have East Indians, and they were brought as indentured laborers to the extent of like 240,000. So they didn't come as visitors, they came to make a significant impact or to displace the African population that was there in different activities. Launches into that period now between 1838 and build us to 1966. Because we want to get slowly into how we are.
To get there, I want slightly a wee bit to go back into the first period which we just discussed, and to identify a few things. One, that you didn't have a homogeneous society.
Right.
We've already identified that it was not homogeneous in terms of the ethnic groups that were in the society. I think Aubrey's made the point it was not homogeneous because of the layers of class in the society. And one could see in terms of the economic arrangements, you had the Amerindians who were still largely operating at the communal level. And that kind of explained why they didn't get involved in very hierarchical administrative arrangements. But they were there in the communal arrangement. Then you had the slaves who were enslaved. And you see them developing this, what Aubrey referred to, this way of resistance. Now, in the management of the relations, the Europeans would have even in that period, started to portray the Africans as being uncultured, being barbaric to the Amerindians, as rationale for them to be caught and brought back and not be able to go into their communities and poison them with this uncivilized being that they were supposed to be. I think that's important to note, because in some regards those attitudes have come forward, in some regards. And secondly, things which seem to be, people seem to think are innate and probably genetic, are social insofar as it is social conditions that would have fostered their beginnings and their existence. So if the Africans are the ones who in this society seem to be more, in some regards, inclined towards protests, inclined towards certain kinds of resistance, this is not necessarily an indication of any innate or genetic aspect of their personality. It is a process of social reality that has brought them there. And I think that is something that is terribly missing in the Guyanese society. Understanding how these various personalities have emerged, and understanding that the emergence of these various personalities, in fact, has helped to embed the plurality, because having been positioned differently in the society, people have responded differently, and therefore there are different psyches that are evident in the various ethnic groups. So here we have, against that initial background, the coming of the East Indians. Coming in a situation where the Africans had responded to the abolition of slavery in a form of a liberation movement, the creation of the village movement, where they in a sense were on one hand moving off of the estates, and on the other hand being able to bargain for wages in relation to continuation of work on the estates. So demonstrating that they were focused. They knew what is it they wanted. And so here comes the East Indians. Again, their coming was engineered, so you can't blame them for their coming. They didn't come with any malintent in relation to Africans. But as they came into a situation where they were displacing the Africans, that in itself was the basis for some degree of antagonism between the two. Because if I'm here and I am able to use the conditions to a certain benefit, and you to come along and to remove those conditions which I can use, then in fact, whether it is conscious or subconscious or otherwise, what you're doing is hindrance to me, and therefore cannot engender love. It can engender hate, but certainly not engender love. So here come the Indians, and in that situation, not only is there that more or less natural antagonism, but it's massaged, because the Europeans recognizing what was good for them in terms of being able to continue the exploitation on the estates, again sold the story to the East Indians that these people were uncultured, these people were barbaric, and therefore these are people that you should stay far from, and things of that nature. And the reality is that again you're embedding in the society traits that have not necessarily been eradicated, traits which have found themselves right through to the modern country. That is important to note, because ever so often some people seem in their analysis to stop at the point of the post 55 period, as if that is where the problem began. But the problem, in fact, was there from the very inception. There may have been periods when it was more latent than others, but certainly the underpinnings of the problem have always been there. And what we need to note, however, is that during this period which we are now referring to, not only did the Indians come, but we also had the coming of the Chinese and the coming of the Portuguese, who for various reasons did not remain on the estates. And they got involved in commerce, they got involved in trade, and again we see a complexity arising because they then became a part of that class structure in the society. But a class structure that also approximated in some regards to color, because both the Portuguese and the Chinese are not Negroid. And so here we have fair-skinned people coming in, and since they didn't stay in the estates as laborers and they went out there into trade and commerce, one could see a kind of hierarchical system evolving with the Europeans, followed by these other Mongoloid groups, and then the Indians and the Africans. Now, so that emergence, in a sense, was a period when really the true plurality, the total plurality of the society evolved, and in that plurality we saw a certain kind of division of labor. A certain kind of division of labor. We saw the Africans in some regards as free agents in the villages in the first instance. We saw the Indians as workers come peasants, and I think we have to be aware of this. The Indians were never totally a working class, even as classes emerged, because one of the things that happened when they came, they were given, notwithstanding their exploitation of their labor, and one has to accept that as a fact, they were given conditions to facilitate the continuation of their culture and their belief system, and that was a part of the mechanism for division, that you continue so that you are accommodated and you're not infected, you're not quote-unquote creolized, as my friend Ravi Dev would like to say, not creolized. And so in that regard also created some feeling of superiority over people who are barbaric, who are creolized, who are uncultured. And in that division of labor, you have that kind of structure and that kind of disposition towards each other arising, with administration being in the hands of a certain set of people, with emergent commerce being in the hands of another set of people, and the whole question of who is where in terms of the bottom of the ladder. And one could say that in some regards there may have been some struggle for the bottom of the ladder. But with the Europeans seeking to penalize the Africans for their act of self-liberation, flooding their villages and things like that, and there were all sorts of laws about vagrancy and so that affected them, then they had to find a solution. And I would argue that in some regards, having not been completely successful in the act of liberation through the establishment of villages and through establishing your own economy, the Africans, some of them started in a sense to mimic the Europeans. Both in terms of their dress, in terms of the kind of jobs that they then gravitated towards, be it the police force, the lower rungs of the public service. So they started to mimic, and in a sense, the extent to which the Europeans assimilated them into those rungs is the extent to which one could see now more structures emerging, because apart from the hierarchy of the public sector, so to speak, you could see to a large extent the Africans starting to be evident in the other aspects of the public sector, be it in the education sector, the health sector, and the lower rungs, of course, in the first instance. So that another thing to note is that occupational tendencies emerged not out of necessarily a desire, but out of the realities that people were faced with in the society. And so you found that Indians stayed with agriculture because they were facilitated with plots of land in addition to working at the estates, so they stayed with agriculture. The Africans were forced out of villages and agriculture and found themselves in the public endeavor. And the Chinese and the Portuguese continued in commerce, and with the Europeans more and more being removed from the landscape as the system of the estates was being dismantled. Remember, they sold many of their estates off and went back to where they belong. So that we see here the emergence of the Guyana, which in a sense we now have, not yet in terms of the political structures, but certainly in terms of the races and the structures of class, and even the structures in terms of occupation.
Okay, so by the time we get to 1955...
No, but before that, I think we need to note that politics for the African became a politics of protest. I think we also need to note that there has been what I call the deculturization of the African, meaning first the way in which they were brought, families broken up, forced into slavery. They didn't manage to bring and practice their culture. But not only were they deculturized, they were then acculturized to the European culture. And so you had a situation, in my opinion, where there are traits of the African culture that they would have had, but reculturized. Now, that to me produced an African that is different to a Jamaican African. I want to also make the point that once the society started to take on the class color phenomenon, it also produced a dual approach. Some Africans who accepted it and some Africans who resisted it, and therefore again you see a division in the African community. And I'm making this point to point out that a characterizing feature of our colonial and slave past is the constant evolution of divisions, even within groups. It has happened with the Indo-Guyanese community. It has happened with the African Guyanese community. The Amerindians had different tribes, etc. So I do agree with Vincent that at the dawn of
the plural society.
No, I don't want to meet. No, the plural society emerged. I agree with him about that. But I wanted to say, before the political independence struggle, the political struggle for the African became a struggle against the status quo, without, to me, a defining philosophy of where the African will go. And I believe that is important when we come to look at the anti-colonial struggle, because in that phase those elements will emerge.
Aubrey's made a very critical point that yes, there were divisions within the various ethnic groups, but that notwithstanding, the most distinct set of divisions would have been among the Africans. And the reason for that would have been, in the first instance, they didn't come from the same, necessarily from the same tribes. So you brought different tribes. Secondly, having brought them, they weren't able to start from the family unit, which is the basic unit of society. So that the basic unit for their coming together was destroyed, was not allowed to exist. And so with the acculturation that took place, to a large extent what was happening, they were in some regards taking on European values.
Mimicking the Europeans.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which in a sense, if one is to progress, is centered around the emergent democracies and human rights and things like that. But even as they took on those values, they were in societies which, all told, did not quite embrace those values. So they were embracing values that were being, in a sense, oppressed in the society, and therefore they were at odds with the other groups who were allowed to continue with their belief systems, who were far more homogeneous, and therefore were able to continue to be identified not only by outsiders as a group, but by they themselves enforcing their oneness. To a large extent, the oneness of the Africans was more enforced from the outside, with people treating all of them in a particular way, as opposed to them enforcing it from the inside, since to a large extent they started to be involved in individual struggle for survival, which really only works in a context where there are equalities of opportunities and things like that. So they were being attuned to what was not available to them, and therefore became the least cohesive and the more distorted group in society, where there was competitiveness, and the other groups being largely more homogeneous, more cohesive, based on their own inherent belief systems.
Take us then into 1955. We have a plural society with all the ingredients that you talked about, this pot. And then we have this independence movement, where we have a large Indian population, the coming of the political movements, and this is where voting comes in now.
I would put it this way.
Because we have to go from there to where we are now in that time.
I'd put it this way. I think there was a recognition by the intelligentsia, the middle class, the leadership of both the Indians and the Africans, that they were in a dilemma, and that they would not be able to overcome the oppression that they saw each other being exposed to if they were to go it alone. Because now we were in a society that was, in a sense, one society, though plural. And so that led to attempts to bring together the various groups.
They had a common enemy, so to speak.
Yes, and through leadership from the intelligentsia, and here you had the emergence of the political leaders, and in particular the emergence of Jagan and Burnham. They sought to work together, but whether or not you really got the kind of unity at the mass level, one has to ask the question. Whether it was the masses benefited from the convenience of the union, as opposed to a conviction for the union. And I think in hindsight one may argue that the masses, in a sense, were more involved in the benefit of the convenience of the union rather than the conviction of the union, and never really got around to the complete mutuality and mutual respect of each other. There was always this level of suspicion. The leaders kind of ameliorated it insofar as they attempted to lead. And we see a situation emerging in the 50s where you now have the invasion of another element, the ideological element.
The ideological, right, okay. This is when we have the isms.
Yes.
We have the communism and socialism and...
With Chelly Jagan being the doctrinarian communist, so to speak, Burnham being left-wing but not doctrinarian as Chelly was. And you see emergence here of another contradiction which highlighted the plurality of the society. That Chelly Jagan, the doctrinarian communist, was able to mobilize the Indian community, which by virtue of the activities they were involved in and continue to be involved in, could never be seen to be communist, because they were more capitalist oriented, peasantry in the first instance, capitalist oriented. And here is Burnham emerging as the leader of a people who didn't have that cohesion, challenged to bring something to them, to make them cohesive. And that saw in some regards the division, because Burnham in some regards in his search for cohesion sought to find an approach that would speak to all of the communities. So in this whole effort of cooperativism, on one hand it was supposed to be reflecting some of what was happening in Africa, but also he related it to the emergence of the African community here in terms of the villages, the operation of the Indian communities here in terms of how they operate in the extranuclear areas, and he sought to relate it to all of those groups. But to a large extent, it was really a search for something cohesive for the Africans and for the Guyanese
Plural society
at plural society at that time. And that became manifest in the politics. It became manifest, all that was happening became manifest both in the coming together and in the split that occurred in 1955. And that split again showed that though the leaders had been engaged in an enterprise that was not necessarily ethnic oriented, that the mass of people had not really moved away from these groupings. Because when the party split in 1955, one could see a clear ideological split taking place at the level of that intelligentsia. One could see the people who went with Burnham were not the doctrinaire Marxists. One could see the people who went to Jagan were the doctrinaire Marxists. But even as they moved on those two parallel paths, the masses movement did not follow necessarily any ideological orientation. It followed the ethnic divide of the society, which showed that in fact they had not overcome that latent ethnicity, and it had now re-emerged in the face of a split between the two leaders.
I think also one has to recognize that it didn't just emerge at 1966. You had the labor movement. And with the labor movement, you had the sugar workers, you had bauxite workers, you had the stevedore, etc. And even in the labor movement, there were divisions. And it is interesting to know that the trade unions emerged with the ethnic dimension. And that has its own... That was
just before we go on, that was bound to happen for the occupational purposes.
Yes.
Because how the occupations, so the trade unions represented occupational interests. I mean, the labor union represented stevedores, and they were largely African people. The MPCA represented the farmers and the sugar workers, they were largely Indians. So that these institutions were in fact built around the contours that already existed in society. Sorry for
Importantly as well is that it is easy, ethnicity is easily seen. Interest is harder to decipher. And what in essence happened, because interest to me is hard to decipher and sometimes to work out and say to people, that is your interest. The tendency is the easy solution.
Ethnicity.
So ethnicity becomes critical. I think once the society started to think about state power, new divisions started to emerge.
State power.
State power. You see, in the early phases, you were fighting for increased wages, etc. Then you started in the late 40s, early 50s to talk about universal adult suffrage. You wanted to vote. The minute you started to talk about voting and electing your own representatives, you were getting into the realm of state power. And in the realm of state power, what happened, in my opinion, is as you pursue state power, the question of who governs who. Before, the whites governed you.
Everybody.
You didn't have access to state power. So I'm saying to you that with the emergence of politics and the struggle for state power, the question of who will govern becomes more critical. It is now who will govern among this diverse group. Before, one group governing. So that almost with automaticity opened up a avenue for competition. And once the avenue for competition opened, you find that people will vie for power. In the vying for power, in the early phases, you had a united party, or a party in which you had an African and an Indian. I don't really like to say united. You had a party in which both groups were represented, and they pursue certain interests. With the advent of the glimmer of hope with state power, the first time you access state power was in 1953. You access state power at a time when ideology was critical. The Cold War was on after 1945-46. And once the Cold War was on, a lot of the divisions that were in the outer world will now impact on your world. Unfortunately, in the PPP at the time, the PPP of Burnham, Jagan, Guyana, all of them, they had different ideological positions. And these different ideological positions will obviously clash. And as they clash, I think the society was further ruptured. So you have now added to the ethnic, occupational and other forms of division, ideological divisions.
So take this.
What you find in that plurality, though, is that in that plurality with the split, the politicians, in a sense, to justify who will be in charge, do not articulate and address the plurality. They get into a state of self-denial, at least articulation of self-denial, which says, look, really, we don't have any ethnic problems here. This is one country, we all live together, we don't war. And so they proceed as if there is no ethnic issue to be identified and to be addressed. But whilst they behave in that way, at the level of the society itself, there is the problem, and the problem persists. And they, even as they are articulating self-denial, have a recognition of the problem in some regards, and feed off of the ethnic groups, even as they say there is no ethnic problem. So the politicians become a part of the problem, insofar as, rather than using their position to seek to resolve, to identify and resolve the problem, they use the problem to embed themselves, and in so doing, cause the problem in some regards to escalate from time to time.
And it is compounded by ignorance. And I say ignorance of different cultures. I give you an example. When I was a little boy coming up in Linden, a lot of Amerindians live on the outskirts. And what happened is that when Amerindians came out into Linden itself, they were walking one behind the other. And African Guyanese would say they walk like buckmen. It only dawned on me one day when an Amerindian man said a few years ago, if you want to walk in a track and walk like how y'all is walking Linden. Now, because Amerindian communities use these tracks, because Amerindian community use these little tracks to walk in, they walk one behind the other. Now, you who are not into that, don't understand the cultural aspect of it. I just give you that simple one. But now take it to the religious elements, the other elements.
Yeah, yeah.
There are many elements of ethnic groups that one doesn't understand. And because of that ignorance, you either decide that your own is superior, or they decide that their own is superior to you. And what happens is a new conflict, a conflict now over perception of our cultures.
Based on ignorance.
On ignorance.
Based on ignorance.
Yes.
And therein emerges the stereotyping and the prejudices which have become the manifestation of the problem in its worst form. Because rather than investigate, understand, appreciate, respect the differences are stigmatized.
Become competitive.
And people are stereotyped in relation to those differences, and the society now has very hard divisions, because literally people are brought up in communities where you're led to have disregard for the other person based on these elements that you do not understand, which are not elements, like I said in my very first intervention, that are generic or innate. They're elements that are responsive to the environment. They're social, and therefore they're explicable. And not only explicable, should be acceptable. But rather than being explicable and acceptable, we find them as unacceptable and as a source for distancing oneself and having this kind of stereotyping, kind of prejudices, which can now be exploited by leaders who wish to keep the groups segregated.
And it is all of that you take to elections. In fact, I believe this elections is one in which you have to try and combat many of those elements, because if you go to this election with the same stereotypes, you will get the same results. However, if you go to the elections recognizing that you can, like Vincent said, these things are not innate. They are not part of your biological makeup. They are a logical sequel or consequence of your politics, your history, your economic structure, and your social structure.
I think now what you're saying then is that within the next 6 weeks, we have a major effort to try and raise the consciousness even further of the basic reasons that you addressed here, of the plural society, why it is the way it is, but try to get people to understand that these are solvable problems within the context of Guyana.
Indeed,
within the context of Guyana.
Indeed, it is the challenge, and the challenge is humongous, because we still have leaders who do not accept in their politics that this is the situation which has to be resolved, and still on the face of the matter engage in denial, but in the real politics of the matter seek to exploit these dysfunctionalities of our society.
What would happen if, then this is hypothetical, or maybe reality in some cases, what would happen if the masses get an understanding of really what's going on and ask the leaders, what are you telling us? Wouldn't that be an interesting dynamic?
It would be certainly an interesting dynamic.
An interesting dynamic. If the masses confront the leaders and say, we have information now based on our knowledge base, our expanded knowledge base, that what you were telling us is partly true, but partly for your benefit.
That seeks to explain why is it.
Is that a dynamic that...
that seeks to explain why is it.
Make a better Guyana.
That the media is so critical, and why is it that control of the media is so critical? Because in the modern age, with exposure to information, these barriers can in fact be broken down. In the modern age, if we were to have enterprises, like for example they had in Malaysia. In Malaysia, they had an ethnic problem as well. What did they do? In their housing enterprise, they sought to create mixed communities so that people could have shared experiences of each other. You know, I have, as a Guyanese, have spoken to Indo-Guyanese who said to me I only understood an African Guyanese when I went to national service, because there is where I had the exposure to the African Guyanese, and vice versa. So that really there's a need for institutional arrangements that will allow for the exposure, for the understanding, and for the mutual respect. And the media is one such big institution, and we can now understand why is it the media is treated the way it is treated, because the media could be one of the places in which the problem is solved. And so it behoves the media and programs like this to speak to the people at large, for them to understand what the problem is, because the fact of the matter is that even as we continue along that path, the logic is that the country will not be the beneficiary of those different paths, because in the global world that we live in, the country needs to have some commonalities to be able, as a country, to relate to the world, as a country, to relate to resources for its development. And so, even out of self-interest, if the people are exposed to the information, they could come to recognize the need for mutual respect, the need to deal with issues from the standpoint of commonality, rather than to deal with issues from the standpoint of ethnic interests.
Aubrey, we've got 2 minutes.
I believe that we are at a point where change is possible. I'm not saying a guarantee. It's possible. And it is possible because I believe there is a young generation that are interacting, understanding each other culture. And apart from understanding each other culture, there's a negative that is acting as positive for us. I think a lot of the Western cultural influences that we consider negative, they are acting as a unifying force.
A commonality.
They're creating a commonality amongst our youths. I think technology is doing the same thing. And so I believe that, particularly in this election, depending on how you campaign, if you can eschew the old approach, then you can break the barrier.
So we have a kind of a dichotomy here, where acculturation, which one would normally want to reject, has become a positive element in terms of bringing the Guyanese people together. And we see, however, resistance to that by certain groups, consciously resisting that acculturation, which is not necessarily imposed something. It has some naturalness about it, acculturation. We know what the West is about, we know the domination and all of that, but there's some naturalness about acculturation.
I mean, previously we were defined by our clothes then, what we wear. Now, virtually all ethnic groups, you can't define them by their clothing, because their clothing is coming from one source, and many of them have abandoned the old approach to dress, and again that is acting as some form of a unifying force.
As well as there be some integration, so the music represents some integration, so they can identify with the music because it represents from the various sources. And all of this is a kind of a natural development.
Well, gentlemen, we are almost out of time, but we have only gotten to 1955 or 1966. Now, we haven't gotten to 1966 yet. So what we'd like to do is next time, could we continue with this discussion so that we can further provide what as you described is very important, needed information, so that people can clearly understand what is the nature of this plurality and what are the elements in that plurality that are causing the nation to not function as a nation in terms of the relation to the outside world, and also in terms of relation to its individual. Mutual respect is one of the things. Mutual respect. We've got to get there. So thank you, gentlemen, but you will be back next time.
Thank you.
So that is it for the Coffee 250 program this evening. We've had Mr. Vincent Alexander and Aubrey Norton, and next week we will be continuing with this discussion, and hopefully we'll get a chance to go from 1955 to where we are today. Thank you. Until next time.